I would like to welcome you to the session, Citizen Science for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This conference currently is titled as Open Knowledge, Fair Futures. And I would like to argue that without open knowledge, there will not be a fair future. It is quite striking in what conditions we are at the moment, with the current populists all over the world trying to get votes. And we are already scared of the upcoming election. It's time probably for a knowledge society, an open society which is critical and is able to detect fake news in the social media. I think it's time to change. It's time to move forward in this transformative process and to more closely engage with citizens and give citizen science a voice, empower them, and let them more openly participate in scientific endeavors. And there has been actually quite some time in the last two decades where citizen science has played a role and is playing an increasingly a very important role. But you can already go back, for example, more than 100 years where the first citizen science projects have started. And that time already a behavioral change, actually a very drastic behavioral change has taken place. And this was around the 19th century, when people were still shooting birds as a hobby around Christmas. The famous Christmas bird count, which was then changed from shooting birds to counting birds, a dramatic behavioral change in what has happened around the 20th and the 19th century. I would argue we need more of those transformative behavioral change processes, in particular, if we want to address the Sustainable Development Goals. You can see them as three major challenges. So the 17 goals with 169 targets, with 247 indicators by now, which measure this if we are on track of those targets. You can also just think about the big challenges, which are biodiversity loss, inequality, relates to poverty, alleviation of hunger, and climate change. These are really the synthesis challenges we are currently facing. As we know, there are really big gaps currently in the data we have to properly monitor and to understand if we are on track to meeting the Sustainable Development Goals and to address these big global challenges. And some countries, they just do every 20 years their census, they have hardly any household survey, and that means there is really not enough data to fully understand if we are on track on the Sustainable Development Goals. Therefore, we need new data sources. And if you think that nowadays, in the age of digitalization, in the last 2 years, 90% of the data is produced. There's a real data flow. There are masses and masses of data from all over the place, from remote sensing, from social media, but also the biggies like Google and Amazon's, they own a lot of our data. We have to be aware. Maybe it's time to also tap into the potential of citizens' data, and there are lots of citizens' projects, and we have shown this in some recent research, that not only citizens are able to contribute very valuable data in the field of biodiversity. That is currently the most contributing field in citizen science project, but also, for example, the OpenStreetMap project has been extremely successful. And more these activities where citizens passively also actively contribute to data are termed citizen science, where citizens make an active contribution to the production or co-production of scientific knowledge. And this is where we are. Actually, my name is Steffen Fritz. I'm from the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, and I'm currently heading a group and a center on Earth observation and citizen science. I've had also a European science grant called Groundland, which was looking at how Earth observation and citizen science can come together to provide land cover and land use information. And I'm also the coordinator of the Landsens and WeObserve project, though Inian Murthy is currently very active and mostly managing the Landsens project, and Gerrit Hager is mostly managing currently the WeObserve project. And with that, I would like to introduce my colleague Dilek Frazel, who has also done quite a lot of work around the SDGs and done quite interesting work. I contribute in particular to monitor SDGs with two different indicators. Frazel is a research scholar at the ecosystem research group. It will be called like that in the future. Currently, it's still the Center for Earth Observation and Citizen Science. She's very much active in the WeObserve project and is leading the community of practice within the WeObserve project on the sustainable development goals and how citizens can engage and contribute to it in monitoring, but also in addressing the SDGs. She's also active in and a member of the Sustainable Solutions Development Network in the thematic research field of data and statistics, SDSN trends. And with that, I don't want to waste any more words. I would like to hand over to Dilek Frazel, my colleague, who will then introduce also the other speakers. To you over, Dilek. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steffen. So for the very nice overview, for the nice link with the European agenda, and a very generic overview about citizen science and the contribution of citizen science to the SDGs. My name is Dilek Frazel. Steffen was breaking a little bit while introducing me, so I will just quickly say that I work at the Center for Earth Observation and Citizen Science of the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, and I'm the moderator of this session, as Steffen mentioned. So before I start to give you an overview, I would like to start by thanking all the speakers and participants of this session for joining our session. And we are very delighted to have you all here today. So in this session, we will first start by some opening remarks from each and every speaker that we have here. They're all very valuable and they have amazing work that they have been doing on this end. And each presentation and each speaker will be followed by a few questions from the audience, and we will ask them your questions. And then we will have a discussion all together. So please feel free to use the chat button to post your questions, and we will try to answer them after each and every presentation, as I said, and at the end of the session. So after some, or before the end of the session. So after some logistical information, we can actually give this start. So once again, welcome to our session on the citizen science for the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, as of 2020. As we all know, SDGs are a call to action to address the world's most pressing challenges, as Steffen mentioned, from poverty to climate change. And to achieve these goals, we need to know where exactly we have made progress, or where we are missing progress, where we need more resources, and where we need policy changes or improvements. So even though the data availability increased in the last year, thanks to new technologies, there are still major gaps in our knowledge. So so we're missing some very valuable information that could feed into the policies to achieve the sustainable development goals. So in this session, we will discuss citizen science as a new source of data, as one source of new data source actually, and to address some of these challenges. So we will talk about what is the real potential of citizen science for filling the data gaps in the SDG framework and ultimately for achieving the SDGs, and how we can realize this untapped potential, basically. So we will provide some concrete examples of the potential that citizen science offers for SDG monitoring and give concrete recommendations on the next steps for the citizen science community, for the global data and statistics community, UN agencies, national statistical offices, you name it. So before leaving the virtual floor to our presenters, I would like to mention a recent research study that we undertook at IIASA as part of the European Commission funded We Observe SDGs and Citizen Science Community of Practice Stefan mentioned. This basically is a community of practice that is open to anyone who is interested in joining, understanding the citizen science contribution to the SDGs together with us. So please feel free to join through our We Observe project website under the communities of practice session. So the aim of the Sdg Scope is to connect citizen science practitioners, researchers, national statistical offices, UN agencies, government officials, other international agency representatives, and broader data and statistics communities to exchange knowledge on how to demonstrate the value of citizen science for SDG monitoring and also for impact for the SDGs. For those who are not really familiar with the term citizen science, Stefan gave us a very nice overview, but I would like to mention very briefly on our perception of what citizen science is, because it's very relevant to the research study that I'm going to talk about soon. So it is basically public participation in scientific research and knowledge production. Although there is no agreed definition or term to describe citizen science activities, these activities could vary from participation in data collection activities or basically identifying research questions together with the scientists. Our all-embracing and inclusive approach to citizen science include many different approaches and many different terms, such as maybe you know it as citizen-generated data or crowdsourcing or participatory action research or community-based monitoring, and many others like this. So going back to the research that I was mentioning before, the aim of our research study was to conduct a systematic review on the contribution of citizen science data to SDG monitoring, and the results of this study are published in the journal Sustainability Science. And what we wanted to do with this work was to present where exactly citizen science data are already contributing and could contribute to the monitoring of the global SDG indicator framework. So therefore, we looked at the all SDG indicators. We studied their metadata and work plan and methodology in detail. And also we looked at the citizen science initiatives at any scale from global to local and mapped their existing potential contributions to each and every SDG indicator. So one of our most interesting results was that actually we were expecting that, but it was still interesting to confirm that citizen science data have a great potential for contributing to the SDG indicators. So it's actually 33% of the whole SDG indicator frame of the indicators. So at that time when we were doing this study, there were 244 SDG indicators, because this is an evolving framework, and citizen science was able to contribute or is able to contribute 76 of the SDG indicators, or could contribute 76 of the SDG indicators, and already contributing to 5 SDG indicators. So this is together, as I said, about 33% of the whole SDG indicators. And this is a great potential. And what we identified, actually, the greatest contribution of citizen science to the SDG monitoring would be in respectively SDG 15, this is life on land, SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities, SDG 6, water, clean water and sanitation was the fourth one, and SDG 3, good health and well-being. So these are the goals that citizen science data could contribute to the most. And this actually shows us that the greatest potential from citizen science data to SDG monitoring would be in environmental SDG indicators. So I would like to give you one example now from one of the tools that we developed at IIASA. This is Picture Pile. And this is a tool basically that could help monitoring of many of the indicators, but particularly for indicator 152, that is about quantifying direct economic losses that results from a disaster. So this means direct economic loss means total or partial destruction of physical assets in an affected area. So Picture Pal for post-disaster damage assessment is a project where volunteers classify basically satellite images to identify damaged buildings after a disaster occurs. And Picture Pal is a generic and flexible tool for ingesting imagery that can be rapidly classified by volunteers. And these images can be drone images, very high resolution satellite images, or geotagged photographs. Examples of using Picture Pile for SDG monitoring purposes also include mapping poverty for some indicators under SDG 1 and some others, and human settlements related indicator under SDG 11, change in the water extent and ecosystem health related indicators under SDG 6, or agriculture area cropland related indicators under SDG 2, marine leader indicators that we will talk a lot about today as a very nice example under SDG 14, and deforestation, and many others under SDG 15, in addition to the post-disaster damage assessment. So with this study, I mean, of course, I can give you more overview, but we don't have time here. But I basically suggest you that you could find this research study and read in journal Sustainability Science, as I said. But we know now more or less what the real potential of citizen science data is with this research, and many others that colleagues from different organizations did, or we all did together. But what next? What is next? How can we realize this potential fully? What are the key actors, or who are the key actors that we need to talk to? Which stakeholders we need to work with? What are the best examples we can amplify, and where we can amplify them, and how? So I would like to leave the floor to our speakers now to guide us through all these questions and many others that you also have. So I would like to start by Jillian, actually, who is currently in Nairobi, but this will change soon. Jillian Kemple has joined the UN Convention on Biological Diversity this year, where she is responsible for monitoring of the 2020 post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, including national action planning. So prior to that, Jillian led the methodological work on the Sustainable Development Goal indicators under the UN Environment Program custodianship, and this includes the indicator, SDG indicator on marine litter. Many of these indicators, including the indicators related to marine litter or beach litter, floating plastic debris, or debris in the water column, lack sufficient data for understanding the current state and trends. In order to improve the compilation of environmental data, including on marine litter, Jillian has been working to bring in new data sources, such as data from citizen science, satellite data, and many others. So Jillian, could you please tell us why UNEP was interested in citizen science and working with the citizen science community for closing some of the data gaps in the environmental SDG indicators? We also know that UNEP developed a methodology on marine litter that suggests the use of citizen science data as a primary source of data. So under the SDG indicator 1411. So how did this whole process take place? What are your experiences? Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Thank you so much, Dilek. So I'll take a step back. When the SDG indicators were developed, so the SDG targets represent a set of global priorities. So what is it that we want to measure? And so it was sort of a wish list of what is the information that we need. If you go to the next slide, this is the question, right? I mean, this is also what Stefan said at the beginning. How do we manage our natural resources? How do we provide food and water and energy for the growing population, while at the same time protecting the planet's biodiversity and ecosystems, so that our children and our children's children also have the resources that they need, and then they can also enjoy the planet that we live in. So next slide. So this is how the SDG indicators were established was, what are these global priorities in terms of the environment and also social and economic development? And so there were 169 targets set up in the SDGs, and 93 of these indicators are related to the environment. So they match with about a third of the targets, and about a third of the indicators relate to the environment, which seems fair. So this is, on the one hand, this is what we want to know. On the other hand, as both Stefan and Dilek said, we have all of these different sorts of data. We have citizen science, we have satellite data, we have traditional data collection from censuses and surveys, we have IoT devices. So we have a whole new realm of data and also possibilities for data integration. And so that's on one side. And then on the other side, we have this sort of wish list of what we need to know so that we can take ourselves towards sustainability. Next slide. Unfortunately, there's a mismatch between what we need to know and how we're actually compiling data right now. And so as we developed these SDG indicators, which, as I said, they represent more of a what we want to know situation, we only had 68% of them with data. So for most of the environment-related SDG indicators, we can't actually assess global progress. And then if you want to disaggregate it and look, at smaller areas, look within a particular coastline, or if you want to disaggregate certain indicators by gender or by other vulnerable populations, you don't have this information available. And there's not that much actually in the SDGs that captures state and trends. So the SDGs are still not taking us where we want to go. And so from the perspective of UNEP, where I was working at the time, but also in my new job, it's not so much, we didn't come at this thinking, well, how do we work with the citizen science community? It was more, how do we actually answer the questions that we want to answer? How do we provide information to governments, to local stakeholders, to the people who could use this information to make decisions and make the world a better place? How do we get that information to them without it costing $1 trillion? There's no way for us to use traditional ways to measure all of these different indicators, sort of your survey and census approach and having all this information collected by government employees. We don't have the money. I mean, the world doesn't have the money to do it that way. And so this is why we've really sort of tried to say, okay, well, we can't just send government employees out to measure everything that we want to measure. So let's go back to the information that we do have and how do we expand that and better use this? And citizen science is really the example of how we do this. So you go to the next slide. Citizen science is empowering people to collect data. It is at the center of this sort of picture. It's getting people out there. There's, as we were saying, there's going to be 9.4 billion people on the planet likely by 2030. That's a lot of people. If we can get just a fraction of those people involved in collecting data in a coherent way, then this is going to contribute to knowledge. Additionally, those people are also informing themselves through the process and more likely to use data in their own decision making. And citizen science also has the potential to connect with traditional knowledge. It does collect with women and men, so you can, you do have a broad range of stakeholders that are involved. And there's a lot of potential, as Dilek mentioned, to collect data on these environmental indicators, getting people out into the environment and collecting information on the environment. So next slide. So one of the examples that we see where this is something that we're sort of using as a case study is, as was mentioned, on the marine litter. Right now, there's not good data on marine litter. We don't actually know how much plastic is in the ocean. We don't know how much plastic is on beaches. The data that we have is not comparable across places, and it's not coherent, so that, we can't get an accurate picture of what the world looks like in terms of marine litter. Next slide. And so, here we've done sort of a mapping of how litter flows from one place to the next. How does it accumulate on land? How does it flow through rivers? How does it go into the ocean? And how does it end up on beaches? And when you think about what citizens can do, this is an area where people are already working. People are interested in cleaning up their natural environment. People are doing river cleanups and beach cleanups. People care when they see litter in these places. And so this is why it's such a good example of how do we then get people to say what they're seeing and do something about it, and also feed that information back to us so that we also know where litter is, and we can use this to do global estimates of the concentration or the density of litter in these different places. And Anne will talk a lot more about the work that has been done to try to integrate some of these different data sources, but it's a real opportunity to get people out involved in collecting data. And additionally, as I mentioned before, governments cannot afford to collect the micro scale data that we need on all these different places on a regular basis. And so the only way for us really to have this sort of information in a timely way that has a good geospatial coverage is to get people involved and to get people to volunteer. Next slide. So these are some of the different apps that are already out there. So there's heaps of data that's already being collected on this topic. And so it gives us a starting point for saying, okay, well, how do we then bring these together? How do we get people involved? And how do we use the engagement that we have to upscale engagement and to connect people back with the data that's been collected so that they are also empowered to want to make changes in their own lives and to be more active in the political scene so that they can encourage the politicians and those around them also to make policy changes that will reduce marine litter. And so I think, you know, this is a great example of where there's already a lot going on and we can really take advantage of that. And so this is what we've been proposing for this SDG indicator on beach litter that I showed you earlier. So next slide. So I am going to conclude and hand back over to Jillian, but I just would like to encourage everyone in this meeting today to, you know, to consider citizen science as an opportunity in your own personal life. Think about what it is that you're passionate about and try to get other people out also so that we really can have more information and fill some of these knowledge gaps as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jillian, for this wonderful presentation. It was very, very nice. I don't see any question from the audience yet, but I have one for you. We know your experience, and you were talking about how great potential citizen science has. So, but we also do not see much of improvement in terms of the use of citizen science data. So I would like to ask you, by the national statistical offices, by governments, so I would like to ask you, is there a reluctance on the use of citizen science data or any other new data sources, basically for SDG monitoring? And if yes, why is that?
So I think there is some reluctance on the part of NSOs or national statistical offices and others to take this data on board. And there's a few reasons. One is that for many government employees, the idea of citizen science is new and it presents certain challenges. There's, you know, anything that's new, well, how do we bring it in? How do we validate the quality? How do we do this? And so I think that just this, how do we get started, is an obstacle. And so this is another reason why what we've been saying is we need to bring the citizen science community and the policy community together a little bit more so that we can talk about how we can do this. And then the other issue, I think, really is that some of the data is not very accessible. It's not easy for governments to use or to bring in. It's not necessarily shared in a way that makes it accessible or harmonized or easy to process. And I think Anne's going to talk about this. And I think that this is a role that some of us working at the global level can fill by helping to provide easier to access information so that every government is not struggling with how do you bring this in.
Okay, thank you, Jillian. That summarized it quite nicely, actually. But we will get back to that question again, and at the end of the presentations, probably, because I'm sure all of you have a lot to say on that. Thank you once again. And for the interest of time, I think we should go ahead with Ann Bowser. And now from Nairobi, we're going to Washington, D.C. and hear from Ann. So Ann Bowser is the Director of Innovation at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. This is a quasi-government think tank in Washington, D.C. The Wilson Center has a decade of experience working in open science, including through community development and policy activities, strategic research and analysis, and work on supporting technological infrastructure. For example, the Earth Challenge 2020 initiative looks across 6 research areas to make existing citizen science data more open and fair through use of tools like data standards and open APIs. One goal of Earth Challenge 2020 is to bring together disparate citizen science data sources to better enable monitoring against the SDGs, particularly the Marine Leader Indicator 1411 that Jillian gave us a presentation about. This explores the marine plastic pollution, the extent of the marine plastic pollution. So, Anne, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks for that great introduction, Dilek, and thank you also for convening this session. So you mentioned in my bio Earth Challenge 2020, and that's primarily what I'm going to talk about today. So April 22nd, 2020 was the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And the Wilson Center, together with Earth Day Network, the US Department of State, and many others, saw this as an opportunity to help modernize, especially the US, but also the global environmental movement, especially through Earth Day Network's lens, and make it participatory by creating a new citizen science platform, which is Earth Challenge 2020. And we set out with 2 primary goals. The first goal was to increase the amount of open and interoperable citizen science data. And the second goal was to empower the public to share information and drive policy action. In terms of how we achieve these, for goal 1, we took an open standards-based approach to working with existing citizen science data sets. So we actually have a lot of great European partners on this particular project. We work through the Open Geospatial Consortium on a standard called Sensor Things API. And a lot of work was actually funded through Horizon 2020 citizen observatories. And the goal of this standard is to allow citizen science projects to collect data on whatever phenomenon they're interested in their local communities, and allow volunteer management and support and interaction to happen at that level, but create a backbone and an infrastructure that allows for bringing those data sets together and making them interoperable so that local data could be combined into national, regional, or global data sets as desired. And in addition to the work on the standards itself, we also created an open API platform that currently has 13 citizen science data sets in it. Our second goal we reached by building a new mobile app that allows for a range of data collection activities. And what's unique about this app, I think, is that in addition to letting people submit data after volunteers make their contribution, it displays a pop-up with a very specific prompt that links to resources that we call the What You Can Do resources. And these are, in many cases, opportunities for direct advocacy, things like sign a petition on, for example, banning a specific single-use plastic, that were actually designed with the different countries and the different country governments in Earth Day Network's network. So this was their contribution to citizen science, which was to make it a little bit more actionable and directly linked to decision-making on the individual standpoint. Our contribution at the Wilson Center was really focusing on the data and the opportunities for elevating existing research. And we initially decided to focus on 6 research areas. And the reason why we came up with these 6 research areas is that in 2017, we launched a global consultation to policy audiences, research communities, and also members of the general public, asking people to say, what are the most critical questions in human and environmental health? And we got responses from 7 continents, including a research station in Antarctica. And one of the 6 that came around was, what is the extent of plastic pollution? So because we really care about the research outcomes and links to top-down policy as well as advocacy, the Wilson Center started working with the United Nations Environment Program and other partners and really looking to the SDG framework to help even further guide our priorities for data integration especially, and then also data collection. And this brings us to SDG 14, which Dilek and Jillian have already mentioned, which is about the health of our oceans. The goal of SDG 14 is to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources by significantly reducing the amount of plastic pollution by 2025. And the specific indicator or proposed monitoring parameter that we're interested in is beach litter originating from national land-based sources, specifically that is collected through citizen science data, including structured monitoring and including in conjunction with beach cleanup campaigns. So what we did is we found 3 existing citizen science projects with really relatively comparable methodologies. And these were the European Environment Agency's Marine Litter Watch, the US NOAA's Marine Debris Monitoring and Assessment Project, and then a citizen science program called TIDES that's run by the Ocean Conservancy, which is a global NGO. And using categorization for plastic debris that was proposed by a research institution in Australia called CSIRO, and our work with the Open Geospatial Consortium's data standard, we were able to bring these 3 data sources together and come up with this visualization based on the integrated data set, which basically allows people to click on any country around the world and see the top 10 sources of marine debris. And this is primarily designed to demonstrate the value of bringing together citizen science data. And then there are also additional use cases, like understanding what single-use plastic would be most effective to ban in a particular geography, which is a pretty local level use case. What we weren't able to achieve, primarily because of the limitations in the data, was coming up with a global baseline data set on the number of pieces of plastic per square kilometer, which is actually how we're trying to measure plastic pollution in accordance with the SDG framework for 14.1.1. I mentioned that Earth Challenge has a lot of partnerships, and this is our model for helping the project have impact. We try to provide a baseline, we try to do the first step, and then work with other people to take it forward. So on the technical side, one really valuable partner was IBM. And the Wilson Center, UN Environment, IBM, and I think a few others recently worked together on a 3-week sprint to come up with this pilot platform, which is a pilot global platform for marine debris, and then also take our data and manipulate it in various ways, analyze it in various ways to try to get at that metric of number of pieces of plastic per square kilometer. And IBM was able to do this, at least on a pilot level. A second really important partner that we have is UN Environment. So I mentioned that there is a broader platform for understanding marine debris. And the work that IBM did will be a key component of this platform. And through the UN Environment Partnership, we're also exploring how to actually pilot the use of this platform by 3 different member states to use this data in SDG reporting. We have a couple more things that we want to investigate. We want to try to understand how mobile technologies can be used to contribute data directly to the SDG framework as well. And then we're also interested in understanding the value of citizen science to other SDGs based on Dilek's work especially, and then also what different partners, including UN Environment, see valuable in the future. So thanks again for convening us, and I look forward to participating in the rest of this discussion.
Thank you so much, Anne. This was really great. I don't see any question from the streaming audience at the moment, but I have a question for you to like understand about your experiences. So what were the biggest limitations, or what are the biggest limitations to data integration in your own experience?
It's interesting because it's both a limitation and not. So I mentioned that we found 3 data sets with comparable methodologies. They're not exactly the same, but one thing that they did have in common is that they all categorize plastic pollution in relatively the same way. So for example, maybe somebody categorized pollution as a styrofoam cup or a foam cup or a hard plastic cup. Maybe a different project just said cups. But in general, those 3 projects talked about cups, bowls, straws, and things like that. There were other citizen science projects like Tangora Blue, which is a really successful program in Australia that categorize the plastic data in such different ways. So for example, treating it like a function, like this is a toy, this is a personal care product, this is something that you would get out of a picnic. That became really impossible to bring in at the granular level with the other data sets that we were working with. So on one hand, that limits what we can do in terms of bridging local data, but I'm hesitant to call it a limitation because the logic model of what we're trying to achieve says that we really respect the need to set monitoring priorities locally and respect those decisions. So if Tangora Blue and Australia cares about personal care products and toys, then that's their prerogative.
Okay, thank you so much, Anne, for this lovely presentation. It was really interesting what you're doing and very successful project. So good luck with that. It will continue for a while. So now from Washington, D.C., we come back to Europe and we go to actually the Netherlands, to Delft, to be more precise. Uta Ben is an associate professor at the IIASA Delft in the Netherlands, and she leads citizen science projects in Europe, in the Middle East, and Africa. And she's also leading the Citizen Science and Earth Observation Lab, what they call CISL, for the European Space Agency. She is also co-chairing the Citizen Science Global Partnership, Citizen Science and Open Data Community of Practice. And also she is co-chairing the Group on Earth Observation GEO Citizen Science Community Activity. So GEO Citizen Science Community Activity is bringing together an international community of practitioners to seek to elevate the value of citizen science data from local to global scales. So Uta, let's hear about your experiences. Could you please tell us about the activities of the citizen science community of practice, or community activity at the Group on Earth Observation? And can you also tell us how do you see the potential of Earth observation data and citizen science data together for monitoring the SDGs?
Thank you very much, Dilek. Thank you for your kind introduction and leading questions. I'm going to address them in reverse order. I'd like to build on what the previous speakers have said and created the urgency for us to achieve the SDGs. Jillian pointed out the enormous data gap that we have, particularly with respect to environmental data, and made a strong case for citizen science. And Anne also showed us how the Earth Challenge could play a role in here. And so I would like to see, okay, how can we join forces then from Earth observation data and citizen science in order to achieve the SDGs? But before we go any further, let's just briefly pause and check that we all have a similar understanding. We heard some definitions of citizen science earlier. When we speak about Earth observation, most people think about satellites, and they are indeed an important part of the remote sensing part. But of course, we also have airborne remote sensing. We have drones, we have the in situ component, which is also part of the way in which we observe the Earth and the ecosystems, etc. Biodiversity, everything that pretty much happens on our planet. We have illustrated here just the European fleet of satellites. Of course, there are more in other regions of the world, and it's also increasingly not only from the public sector, but also from the private sector. And when we look at this picture already, we can see, well, hang on, citizen science is about the in situ component, and increasingly also citizens have drones. So we see there's actually an overlap when we speak about Earth observation. There is a certain overlap with citizen science. And when we look further, how can we bring these two fields together? Of course, the data collection in the field, it can be then used to ground truth remotely sensed data is an image that I think comes to many people's mind, but also it's possible to do desk-based citizen science, if you like, from the comfort from your home. Or in our institute, we hold mapathons with pizza and beer and gather students to classify satellite images, to prepare their classifications, etc. And so there are different forms and ways in which on a practical level we can bring together citizen science, and it's not just the data collection part, it's also the analysis, the processing part that citizen science has a role to play. When we look at the complementarity of Earth observation and citizen science as data sources for monitoring the SDGs, we have an illustration here from the study that Jillian mentioned earlier. In fact, she led the study where we looked very carefully at every single goal and indicator in the SDG framework to see, well, is citizen science already playing a role? And here we can look both at the Earth observation contribution, which the GEO, the Group on Earth Observation study, has shown that actually 29 SDG indicators could be monitored using Earth observation data alone. That means that they can cover about 71 targets. And from our study, we see, well, in principle, citizen science has the potential to contribute to all 17 SDGs. Dilek already spoke about this earlier, but what's the part when we join forces here? We can see, well, actually, when we put these two together, citizen science and Earth observation, where do they overlap? Where can they concretely join forces? We see that 24 of the 29 Earth observation monitored indicators can benefit from additional citizen science monitoring. And together, that means that they cover no less than 11 of the 17 SDGs. But let's make this a little bit more concretely in terms of, well, where does this really, what does this mean in practice when we bring Earth observation citizen science together? I'd like to draw on an example from the CISL virtual incubator that Dilek mentioned that I run for the European Space Agency. One of our pilot projects is the Sentinel Citizen, led by De Waag in the Netherlands. This project is involving citizen scientists in air quality monitoring, and this speaks directly to indicator 1161 with the annual mean levels of fine particulate matter. And citizen scientists are involved even in building their own sensors. But on a technical level, it's a nice illustration of how we can combine the Earth observation data, then clustered citizen science data to really see where are the overlaps between them and how can they jointly give us the detailed forecasting analytical level data that we need. So with Sentinel data, with the citizen science-based air quality data, we can then put the two together and not only see what happened historically in terms of air quality, but also this is a nice example that takes us towards societal action, because it has a forecasting component so that at a local level we can empower citizens to say, well, the industrial steel plant in our neighborhood should bring down production over the coming days because the conditions are such that air quality will drastically drop, given from what we know from our data. So it's really a nice example of how empowering it can be to bring both data sources together, involve citizens in their collection, in their analysis, and then to take that forward in terms of societal action, both with local authorities and local industry players. It's perhaps too nice to be true to say, let's just plug and play these two data sources together and off we go and we solve and we can address several indicators out of 11 SDGs. There's a little bit more that comes into play when we look at them. We have 4 issue and challenge areas, if you like. So the quality of data was already mentioned. It is an ongoing issue to really ensure the quality of citizen science collected data, but also of the issues that citizen scientists would like to cover and to translate these into appropriate experiments. Secondly, from an economic point of view, how can we really capture the value of citizen science for Earth observation data? Citizen science is not for free, although it's often considered to be volunteer time. Many of us lead projects and know that the enormous resources that go into this, not only for physical components and sensors as such, but for the actual meaningful engagement of citizens and specific communities. So we really need to think about sustainable business models that mean we can run these schemes in the longer run to have timelines. From a technical point of view, we need to store the data, but particularly we need to make it accessible. And that is the case both for the citizen science collected data, but also for Earth observation data. There seems to be quite a hurdle still for people not so familiar with Earth observation data, but wanting to combine the two to really find their way through the maze of how they can work with Earth observation data and how they can access it. But also, how do you bring in emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, etc. And from a social perspective, citizen science is built on the engagement of citizens, but not once, ideally for the purposes of monitoring the SDGs over time. That in itself is a huge challenge, not only from the economic perspective that I mentioned in terms of the efforts involved, but really keeping motivations up and keeping this, maintaining this as a meaningful activity for people. So we need to involve people in meaningful ways that takes them out of just being a data provider to really empowering them in involving taking actions towards issues in their local environment. So the way forward, we heard earlier that in Europe, a lot of funding, public funding has gone into it. We see also increasingly that the space agencies, such as NASA in the US, but also European Space Agency in Europe, is really putting up resources to say, hey, there is potential here in bringing these communities together, the citizen science community working with people, the Earth observation, more technical community, and bringing these two data sources, but also communities together. And this brings me to the first part of your question, which is the geo community activity on Earth observation and citizen science, where we are, in a way, yet another community of practice, bringing together interested practitioners working in these two fields or working in one of the two, working together at this intersection, and particularly within the geo context to say we need to really leverage the potential of citizen science that it can provide, of course, in the context of SDGs, but also in the context of the GEO work program and what it's trying to achieve. So I'd like to finish with a warm invitation for people who would like to join this community activity. Please send either myself or Leah Shenley an email. We are currently co-chairing this activities. And with that, I'd like to finish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jutta, for the very nice presentation and very nice examples. They were really interesting. We will go back to some of the topics that you actually mentioned during your presentation, as well as others about data quality, because we have a wonderful speakers, a team of speakers here that could tell us a lot about that from their experiences. But I would like to ask you one simple question. You actually, maybe it's not that simple. So you were talking about engaging or involving people in a meaningful way to citizen science activities. What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, meaningful in this context, I guess, is in the eye of the beholder. What we see from our social science research is that meaningful for people is to know not only that the data they have provided is actually good enough, but what actions are taken on the basis of this. What impact is it having? And so that feedback loop in various ways, not simply saying thanks for this data set, thanks for this observation. That's the most simple feedback loop in a way that we can provide, but really showing them these are the decisions that can be taken. Or if you join forces, these are relevant decisions coming up. These are consultations coming up. That would be meaningful engagement. So taking people out of a mere data collection role and really showing in the data value chain what role they can play in having different decisions taken, and that includes their own decisions. Talking about the plastic examples, I think it's a fantastic example to also show that they can take different decisions personally in terms of buying less plastic and throwing away less plastic into the environment.
Okay, thank you so much, Jutta, for answering this question also very nicely. So now I would like to go ahead with Sven. So we're coming back to Italy from the Netherlands. Sven Schade leads a series of activities at the interplay of citizen science and policy at the Joint Research Center. His work concentrates on global data and policy at the global data standards and connecting citizen science to the global Earth observation system of systems, GEOS, and to the SDG framework. He also looks at the possible contributions of citizen scientists to environmental monitoring and relationships of citizen science with the open science agenda. So you have been working on citizen science and its impact on policies for quite a while. How do you think all these contributions from citizen science data to SDG monitoring we mentioned about could inform policies and how they could be useful?
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Dilek. Thanks for the nice introduction and also for having me in the session for today. So indeed, we just saw from all the previous speakers that citizen science in fact connects to the SDGs and to policies in multiple ways. So what I really want to show a bit in my presentation now is a bit more structure around this discussion, that we can not only look at a single target or a single indicator, but get a bit more of a holistic view. So to start from, this is basically an approach that we use to see how citizen science may be connected to policy. So classically, we have 3 steps in a lot of citizen science projects, which include data gathering, data validation, quality control, and data analytics. And in all of these steps, also a citizen scientist may be involved. What we actually add to this is to connect these results to established policymaking processes to inform about related actions. So here we are also with the feedback that Uta was just mentioning, to actually explain what happened with the citizens' contribution in policymaking. And when a political decision has been taken, we want to monitor the impacts, which to a degree connects the loop, because then you have to collect data again to see if the political decision changed anything. So basically in this scheme, you could run it through for any thematic policy. So for example, we already saw SDG 14 before. It would be going through this cycle actually, but you could also imagine doing something similar in the area of personal health, of clean water and water quality, or biodiversity, which then relates to the respective SDGs shown on this slide. So basically, this is the main way that we structure our discussion on the connection of citizen science and policy making, and how it can connect to multiple SDGs in this sense. What we were not talking about that much so far is that there is also a policy angle to support citizen science. So it's changing the perspective that actually the practice of engaging and people more in the scientific process very much speaks to research policy and the open science agenda. So opening up scientific endeavors to people. And on the other hand, in terms of the connection to policy, providing transparency, doing open consultation about policy options, and providing access to policy information and public sector information in the first place, this is something we call better regulation. And not surprisingly, here you actually see a different perspective on the connection to the SDGs. So basically, if you talk open science and participatory science, you can very well connect it to quality of education. If you talk better regulation, you very quickly end up with strong institutions, peace, and justice. So I think this is an additional angle on the SDGs in relation to citizen science that is sometimes not emphasized enough. Basically, as you see here, all of this can be applied independent of the administrative level. However, the geographic scale of a citizen science project has certain implications in terms of the level of engagement, but also if you can use the data for monitoring. And again, depending if you apply a project at a regional, a local, or even a personal level, an individual level, you can make the connection to the SDGs. So there is always the element of partnership, where partnerships are enriched by engaging citizen scientists. But for example, by applying citizen science approaches to the local level, you also immediately are in the realm of the Sustainable Development Goal number 11, which is about sustainable cities and communities. And you may even take it to the individual level and really talk about reducing inequalities and following an inclusive citizen science approach to also contribute to this goal. So as I was told to make a short intervention, I tried to be really concise and really provide you with a bit of structure for the discussion here. But before closing, I want to really emphasize where we are at the moment, because we are at an exciting moment in time where there are a lot of good examples of citizen science and we see a lot of success stories, but we still need a more structured approach and framework to actually use local solutions also at larger geographic scales. And I would like to emphasize particular two cornerstones that were recently published, which relate to policy monitoring, the monitoring of policy impacts, and to data gathering. On the scientific hand, this is basically a lead article that was published less than a year ago, where many of us in the call actually are co-authors and a lot of more people from the community, which really explains this connection of citizen science to the SDG from a scientific perspective. And the second corner piece, which comes from a European context, was just published a month ago. And this is actually an official document of the European Commission, which really outlines best practices for citizen science and environmental monitoring. So this speaks again to what Jillian outlined before. 93 out of 169 targets are basically environment related. So actually this document gives guidelines to public authorities, but also to communities of practice and to policymakers, how to connect citizen science and environmental reporting. So it touches a lot on what we talked about before on the issues of quality and fitness for purpose of data collected and methodologies, but it also talks about data sharing practices and maybe even more important about the governance and organizational structures. So I highly advise, to, at least in the European context, if not wider, to really consult this document, which has been the result of 4 years' work and really intense expert consultation. So with this, I would stop the intervention for the moment, but I'm looking forward for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sven. This was a wonderful presentation again. And I am actually interested in knowing a little bit more about this tough working document. So what are those best practices? Could you give us some examples, or can you give us a bit more information about that document?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So at the end, the context of this document is that it actually replies to an action plan to streamline environmental monitoring. So basically, there has been 4 years ago, there has been a fitness check of all environmental legislation of the European Union. And as a result to that, there were actions requested to better streamline monitoring processes so that data is only collected once and it's provided to the right channels. And one of the 15 actions, action number 8, was to provide these guidelines and best practices how to use citizen science and environmental monitoring. And it does include guidelines in terms of integrating citizen science data early in the process and really acknowledge and be open in existing processes to also integrate citizen science data at an early stage in the reporting process. But it also comes with a whole set of case studies that actually show what already works and what are good practices. One of the examples is at a global scale is Fresh Water Watch, which is basically providing a global infrastructure for water quality measurements and managing water quality measurements with a common methodology. And interestingly, although the infrastructure exists globally, there are a lot of success stories in neighborhoods, in cities, in regions, and in countries, which show how a common infrastructure can actually be used for very different needs in very different settings all over the globe. So this would be one of the examples I definitely recommend reading. But in general, the recommendations are providing a larger framework.
Thank you, Sven. I think now we can ask some cross-cutting questions to all of the audience, all of the speakers. And I would encourage the audience that are listening to us from the meeting room or from the from live, please post your questions in the Q&A or chat window of your computer, so we can actually address them here. But I would like to actually thank you all, everybody, all the speakers, for the wonderful presentations they gave. And actually, one of the things that all of you touched on a little bit during your presentations here and there was the data quality. So data quality issue comes a lot in, like, everywhere, all the time, in all the presentations that I give, and I'm sure you're also receiving a lot of it. Do you think this is fair? Do you think citizen science data quality is not good enough? Please take the floor to answer, any of you. Or do you want me to point somebody to start with? Sven, would you like to start?
Thank you.
Your microphone is...
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. No, indeed, I think the main issue there is a matter of communication, because indeed a lot of the citizen science projects do apply quite rigorous and clear quality standards, but they're not always well described or well communicated. Well meaning here actually that it really fits the language and the understanding of users in policy. So for example, environment agencies, they have their own vocabulary they use, they have their own ways to describe the quality and data management processes. And it would already help if we find a way to describe the quality or the validation and quality assurance processes that are available in citizen science projects in this language and with these standards. It would already remove one big barrier there.
Thank you, Sven. Jillian, you would like to say something, I guess.
Yeah, I'll add to this also. I wanted to just say that, you know, as a statistician, we talk about data quality all the time. It's not that we're sort of singling out citizen science as being the only area where we're talking about data quality. We need to have conversations about data quality for everything that we measure, especially if we're promoting that this information really be used to make important decisions. And I used to work previously in economic statistics. I cannot tell you. I mean, I spent how much of my life talking about the quality of GDP estimates. I mean, it's not that citizen science is being singled out, it's that data quality is incredibly important. And then I wanted to emphasize what Sven said, which, because data quality is incredibly important, I do think that we have to have better ways to communicate what the quality is and what the constraints are. And we need to be honest about it. And I think that this is where citizen science does have some gaps, is that there's always going to be quality issues with everything. There's going to be quality issues, and you just need to be very open and transparent about what those issues are and how things have been done and what the assumptions are and where the gaps are. And once you do that, then it makes it much easier for people to use that data. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jillian. That's a very nice way of looking at it. Stefan would like to add to that, I guess. Stefan, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Dilek. If I'm also allowed as a convener to say something. Of
course.
Thank you very much.
More than welcome, please.
Now, I just wanted to add a bit on what Sven said, that, you know, there are some quality checks already in place, and I wanted to go a bit more in detail on what these could be and what these are in some applications. So, for example, what is usually deployed is the so-called convergence of evidence approach. So it's many times applied that not only one person does an observation, for example, in the case of, for example, observing biodiversity. And there are lots of applications where at least a minimum of 2 people need to say the same thing. That is generally applied. And then there are also other quality checks which are usually done which is just some simple logic. You cannot, for example, report forest when you know that people are in the middle of the ocean, just as an example. So there are many different technical solutions as well, how you can check certain citizens' contributions and provide also feedback. Thanks for that.
Thank you, Stefan. That's a very nice thing to highlight, actually, that there are many different ways. For instance, training, as we know, training of volunteers is another way, for instance, before starting, for instance, if it's a data collection activity, that really helps. There's a growing body of evidence that also says that training helps, actually. So, Anne, would you like to say anything? Or Uta? Or shall we go ahead with the next question?
I wanted to, sorry, it took a little time to unmute, but I wanted to second the point that Jillian started off with. The data quality or quality of the scientific method as such is a generic issue, and our current science, our traditional science, you know, it has to defend and has to argue that it's sound and replicable. That's one point. And the second part is that the people who worry about data quality actually is not just the policymakers, it's not just the scientists, it's the data, it's the citizen scientists themselves. So we see that a lot in our work on the engagement side. Citizen scientists really want to know, is what I'm doing good enough? Is it the right thing? Have I followed your steps appropriately, so that they know their effort is worthwhile and that their data will be used, which is what their ultimate interest is. So I think that's really important also to see there's a lot of interest from citizen scientists to do it right and to collect good data.
Thank you, Uta. Anne, would you like to add to that, or?
Yeah, just building on that last point, I was going to say something about standards and that being an opportunity for documentation, but I think Uta's point is more important. A lot of citizens, especially in environmental citizen science projects or environmental justice citizen science projects like Flint, Michigan, for example, in the United States, actually do citizen science because they question the quality of official data that's being reported. In addition to Flint, we see this in air quality in China and other places and all over the world. So I would just make the point that considerations around data quality and fitness for use and reliability definitely go both ways.
Yeah. And also maybe one thing to close this conversation, it is also very important to not to look at the citizen science as the whole thing, but maybe evaluate each and every project within their own situation. So it's not like if one project data quality is not high enough, there's no need to basically attribute to the whole field of citizen science, or this is valid for any other type of new source of data or any type of data, even the traditional sources ones, right? So we really need to think about how we're designing, what is the fitness for purpose, as you were saying. So we really need to consider at the design phase how we are going to be addressing the data quality issue in our initiatives as citizen science practitioners and researchers as well. So I would like to go ahead with another question that I would like to hear all of your opinions. So we talked a lot about this, and we talked a lot about challenges. We talked also a lot about opportunities. But what are the real next steps that we need to take for citizen science data to feed into the SDG monitoring effort? So where do we need to start? Like, what are the next steps, one by one? Could you tell me, like, what you think? What is the most important? Where do we need to start? How do we need to go ahead? So, Uta, please go ahead. Thank you.
So I'd like to say, let's not start with the SDGs. You know, our thinking is very much framed by the SDGs, and we know the indicator framework, and you know, we can pinpoint thematically where they are. But actually, most people, and you know, people in their daily life, in their private life, these are the people we want to engage in citizen science. But they don't think in terms of SDGs, indicators, goals, or targets. They think about issues in their local settings. And I think, in order to tap into the potential of citizen science for monitoring, but more importantly for achieving the SDGs, that's where we need to start. We need to start with the people, we need to start with their local issues. And usually what we find in our work, and Sven mentioned this as well, they don't nicely map onto one SDG. Actually, you know, you come with a whole forest of SDGs, that their local issue, you have to then take apart and see which different policy areas do you need to tap into, do you need to provide data into, to really tackle the issues that they're dealing with.
That's a very valid point. Thank you so much, Uta. Considering that, like, if I'm a citizen scientist and I would like to know how my project could contribute to any of the SDG indicators, or I know that which SDG indicator and what type of data that I'm producing could contribute to it, where do I need to start? So what shall I do? Do I need to work with the national statistical offices? Do I need to start redesigning, or do I need to start something completely different? What are the steps in addition to very valid and very important point that you made, Uta? Is there anybody who would like to? Jillian, please go ahead.
So I think actually the paper that you were talking about at the beginning, Dilek, and that Uta showed the slide of, is a starting point. I mean, one of the steps is, first we need to figure out what it is that citizen science can measure. I mean, we as the community that's sort of represented on this panel, the people who are interested in developing these measures have to figure out, where the potential is. The citizens themselves, the people collecting the data, they don't necessarily need to see this mapping, as Uta pointed out. They need to understand how this links back to them, which would be communicated in a different way. But for us, if we are going to be promoting this for use in the SDGs or for use in other global monitoring efforts or national efforts, then we need to demonstrate the value, and we need to have increasing dialogues between the citizen science community, the academic community, and the policy community. Because I think that what's happening is that everyone is sort of working in their silos, and you have government saying, how are we going to measure this? And they're kind of ignoring the citizen science community in a lot of countries, not in all countries. I mean, Sven just was talking about the European example where this is being really explored, but that's not the case around a lot of other countries. And it's not that they're purposely doing it, it's just that those voices aren't getting heard, or they're not involved in these discussions. And so I think this is really the situation, is that we need to strengthen these science policy interfaces at the national level, and as those of us that are working at the global level have a real role to play in terms of promoting this with governments and with the local stakeholders. And this is exactly, I know, what you're trying to do in Ghana, Dilek, which you didn't talk about today, but that we are working on examples where how do we form these interfaces so that we can get national stakeholders really to understand each other.
I was actually going to mention about that at the end, but thanks for saving me that time, Jillian. Yeah, that's a very good example and very relevant example. Is there anybody else who wants to comment on that, or shall I go ahead with the next question?
I have a thought. I think we need to stop treating citizen science projects like projects or like grants and start treating them more like infrastructure. I think about, the SDGs and the temporal dimension and needing baseline data and the benefits of citizen science for providing baseline data. But here in the US, and I know that this is true with some Horizon 2020 projects as well, a lot of citizen science work is funded to answer a particular research question. And in 3-4 years after the PhDs have been awarded and the research question has been addressed, there's not necessarily support for that project to keep working with communities to collect citizen science data. So even if that project did have really great methodologies, read the papers, followed the best practices, you're missing a really critical piece of the project if there isn't a sustainability plan for continuing those activities beyond just archiving the data. I think that's an important piece.
Thank you, Anne. Stefan has a thought, I guess?
Maybe Sven was first, but thanks anyway.
Sorry, I saw you first.
I just want to make one quick point, and this is relates to what Anne said. It's really about the institutionalization of citizen science, and there are some examples where this has already happened. For example, actually, we are in Trieste, or it's virtually in Trieste, but in the Venice kind of catchment area, there has been done cost-benefit analysis. And in this cost-benefit analysis, it was actually shown clearly that the citizen science water monitoring project would be more cost benefit, would be better in terms of the cost benefit ratio than the traditional means of data collection, but also taking into account the awareness and the alertness raising of the citizens to be prepared when there is a flood. So all things considered and everything taken into account, citizen science projects are competitive to those traditional ways of collecting data. And if it's competitive, it essentially means that it's worth investing and putting the money in citizen science project collecting this very important and necessary data. So I think the governments and public authorities shouldn't shy away to put the money for official long-term projects to actually provide the data, but also to involve and engage the citizens and scientists, keep them alert in the case of water and flooding needs, for example. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan, for highlighting that very, very valid and important point. Sven, please go ahead.
Initially, I wanted to say something else, but now I react on the previous two comments. Because I would not really consider citizen science as an infrastructure, but rather see it from the perspective of providing public services that enable citizen science. So it can actually be the purpose of a public service that helps people to live a healthier life or clean up their street, get a clean street, or breathe better air on the one hand. So really addressing the specific needs of different communities. And at the same time, by monitoring the consumption of this service, you also collect data for monitoring of whatever goals you have. But this is just more condensed thought on this, and I see now Uta has a reaction to it.
Can I just comment very briefly?
Yeah,
there seems to be a competition on for reframing citizen science infrastructure services, and I would like to propose let's consider it a social movement. If we're thinking about how we can achieve the SDGs, at the end of the day, we can gather a lot of data, but that's not going to get us there. We need to change behavior. So Stefan also spoke about the awareness raising effect of citizen science, that people simply realize that there's a lot of nutrification of water and of soil because they're creating the huge demand for agriculture to do overproduction, for example. So the more that these cycles are understood, people can actually change their own behavior and don't just play it via the policy cycle, but actually change their own behavior. So social movement would be my hat in the ring.
Thank you, Uta. That was actually my next question. So you already answered that. So I wanted to ask, but very brief comments about what do you think we should do to take citizen science approaches from only monitoring the SDGs to actually delivering the SDGs? Very, very briefly. Who would like to go ahead? Anne, shall I start with you?
Let people say what their contributions are, and in a way that other people can understand and say, oh, I should do that too.
Very nice. Jillian?
I think that if people understand their natural situation better, then it also empowers them to want to do something about it. And I also think a tremendous value is holding governments accountable and demonstrating what the situation really is on the ground.
Okay. Stefan, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I pass to the next one.
Okay, Sven. Because the next question is even more difficult, huh?
Yeah. Now, I would rather make the statement that not everybody has to become a citizen scientist. So I think actually working more on the role of citizen science in the wider social context may be worth to look at next.
Okay, so this actually went, actually took less time than I thought, but if any of you would like to add more to that, so because our main idea with this paper and then with this research that we all talked about, or several other research in this session, we were particularly focusing on monitoring the SDGs, but we also know that citizen science could offer a lot in terms of delivering the SDGs, as Uta mentioned, in terms of behavior change, as Stefan mentioned in the beginning of the session, and also all of you mentioned. So maybe we just need to explore a little bit on that, what citizen science could do actually. We talk about based on a little bit on assumption or other studies that are out there. Actually, there are some studies, there is some research that was done on the social learning outcomes of citizen science initiatives and many others. But how could we connect that to the SDGs? So maybe we could explore how the one example that Jillian and Anne very nicely presented, marine litter. So participating in a marine litter project, data collection activity. What do I get out of it? What do I learn from it, right? So I have like a one question, and maybe only one of you or two of you could answer very really briefly, because we're almost running out of time. And I also have a little things about for wrap up. If you have a magic stick that you could change something, this question was asked to me on a panel that I wasn't expecting, so I was like having difficulties in answering. But I would like to see your creativity. So what would you do to change this, to address on this for the SDGs in general, or for citizen science and the SDGs? Is there any comments or thoughts on that, very briefly? So actually, you,
if I may, yeah, I haven't fully thought this through because I didn't see the question coming. But talking about plastic and talking about daily behavior, somehow we need to go full circle for when we do our shopping and we find everything wrapped in plastic, and every single cucumber, what have you, wrapped in plastic. And in the weekend, I spend my time in beaches cleaning up the plastic. But somehow this whole cycle is just not working out, and that's where we need to see that we don't just involve people on the beaches, but we also then say, these are all the other things you can do in your daily life. You can unwrap it and leave the plastic wrapper in your supermarket. You can ask them to supply different things. You can go to a different shop, to take this broader than just the individual activity on the beach and the nice discussions you might have. And we know a lot of people engage in citizen science because they're looking for community. They're looking to do things together with other like-minded people. And we need to build on that like-mindedness, but also see how that can really translate into other actions and activities in their daily life.
Thank you, Uta. This was a very motivating, very encouraging, almost end to our session. Jillian, you would like to say something after? No?
Well, if I have a magic wand, I think what I would like to do is use it to create magic glasses for everyone. And when you wear the glasses, that you would be able to see the history of what you're using and the future of what you're using, so that you would understand, was there child labor involved, or what you're buying, how was this created, what was the environmental impact of it up to this point, and what will be the environmental impact into the future. And I think that this is part of the problem is that people don't see that history or the future. They're focused only on making the purchase.
Thank you so much, Jillian. That was a wonderful answer, as is Uta's. So I would like to wrap up, because we only have about 3 minutes before the end of our session, about what we talked about today, to summarize a few points that we highlighted. One of them is being citizen science having a great potential for monitoring the SDGs, and it is important to highlight that citizen science, like any other source of data, including new source of data or traditional source of data, has its own limitations and advantages. And it's also not there to replace the traditional sources of data, but it's to complement them, to fill the gaps in our knowledge, right? And as I was highlighting just now, no data source is perfect. So like citizen science, all the other data sources have their limitations, advantages. What we are suggesting here is not basically, and if we want to achieve the SDGs by the year 2030, we need to be able to measure our progress towards these goals and targets. So in order to be able to do that, we need to urgently harness the new source of data and use them to complement the traditional source of data. And for that, we need to bring together all the key stakeholders that we were talking about since the beginning: governments, national statistical offices, citizen science practitioners, researchers, and all the others, the UN agencies, to create an enabling environment so that these discussions could take place and we could really move forward with action. And finally, I would like to end the session by saying that, again, as we discussed, citizen science has the potential to fill huge data gaps in our knowledge for monitoring the SDGs, but it could also help mobilizing action towards achieving the SDGs. So I would like to close this session by actually thanking all the speakers and all the participants that we couldn't see how many actually for technical reasons, I guess, for this very lively discussion, to all of the presenters, and for participating, because I know that some of them have really busy schedules and different situations. And I would also like to thank you as of 2020 group and the conference organizers and all the technical team for making this live streaming session possible. And I would just like to say that please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions that you couldn't ask today. You all have our contact information on the ESOF website. And if you are interested in exploring more about this topic, please join us at the We Observe SDGs and Citizen Science Community of Practice. You can register going through the We Observe Communities of Practice website. Thank you so much once again, and goodbye.